Ancient Greece was less a single country than a long-running civilizational machine, a shifting constellation of city-states, colonies, federations, and kingdoms, linked by language, religion, shared myths, and recognizable cultural forms, yet almost never permanently unified by a single sovereign authority. This combination of cultural cohesion and political fragmentation created an unusually competitive environment in which communities repeatedly tested institutional designs, military systems, economic strategies, and intellectual programs against one another. The result was not a smooth narrative of progress, but a volatile rise of history, crisis, reinvention, and diffusion, one that ultimately left a deep imprint on later Mediterranean empires and on modern constructions of the West. The usual chronological frame begins after the collapse of Mycenaean palace society around the end of the Bronze Age, which centralized bureaucratic centers when centralized bureaucratic centers disintegrated, long-distance exchange networks contracted, and literacy in Linear B vanished. What followed, often called the Greek Dark Ages, was not simply cultural darkness but a period of demographic thinning, regional isolation, and social reorganization. Archaeological signatures such as proto-geometric and geometric pottery show continuity and transformation rather than total rupture, and the eventual recovery in population and connectivity set the stage for the Greek miracle, often attributed to the later Archaic and Classical eras. The critical shift was the emergence of the polis, the city-state, where the core unit of political identity and legal membership, military mobilization, and religious practice was organized. The polis was not merely a town, it was a corporate body of citizens, a legal community that defined who belonged, who could speak and vote, who could own land, who could serve in the army, and who could claim the protection of the laws. Its Parthian form typically combined an urban center with surrounding agricultural land, often anchored by an acropolis, an agora, and sanctuaries that fused civic life with religious observance. The polis also implied a particular kind of political imagination. Rule was conceived in terms of the community governing itself, even when that self was restricted to free native born men. This structure ensured that politics in Greek communities was instantly personal and participatory, yet also brutally exclusionary by modern standards, resting on sharp boundaries between citizens, resident foreigners, women, and enslaved people. Geography amplified these tendencies. The Greek maintained is mountainous and compartmentalized. The Greek mainland is mountainous and compartmentalized with valleys and coastal plains separated by ridges that encourage localized settlement and strong regional identities. The Aegean archipelago and the intended coastline facilitated seafaring and maritime exchange, allowing Greek communities to connect outward even when they struggled to consolidate inward. This produced a cultural world that could be extensive without being centralized. A Greek sphere existed across the Mediterranean, not because it was governed as one empire, but because Greek speaking communities and institutions reproduced themselves in multiple places, interacted through trade, warfare, diplomacy, intermarriage, and religious festivals. The Archaic period conventionally dated from roughly the 8th to the early 15th century BCE was a phase of consolidation and outward expansion. Population growth strained the limited arable land of Greece proper and pushed many communities to establish colonies. Greek colonization was not typically an annexation project. Colonies often became independent polis that retained cultural ties to the mother city but governed themselves. These settlements created a network stretching from the Black Sea to southern Italy and Sicily, from North Africa to parts of southern France and Iberia, and they served as hubs of exchange for grain, metal, timber, luxury goods, and ideas. In this period, Greek communities adopted the alphabet, developed coinage in many places, and absorbed artistic and technological influences from the Near East, producing visible changes in sculpture, temple architecture, and decorative arts. Politically, the archaic world was a laboratory of regimes. Many polis were dominated by aristocratic clans who claimed prestige through land ownership, ancestry, and control of cults and offices. Social tensions often formed around debt, land distribution, and elite monopolization of power. These tendencies sometimes produced tyrannies ruled by a single strongman who seized power outside traditional norms. Greek tyranny in this sense was not automatically equivalent to a later totalitarian repression. Tyrants could be patrons of public works, religious festivals, and economic development, though their regimes depended on force, faction, and personal networks. Over time, the recurring pattern of elite conflict and popular pressure contributed to legal contributed to legal codification, as seen in law codes such as Draco's in Athens and the more extensive traditions elsewhere, reflecting a wider Greek tendency to formalize norms to stabilize competition. Athens, often the most famous case of regime evolution because its sources are abundant and its later influence immense. The Athenian path from kingship to aristocratic magistracies to democratic institutions was neither linear nor inevitable, but it illustrates how crisis can force institutional redesign. Solon's reform attempts to mitigate debt bondage and rebalance political participation through poetry classes, while later transformations under Cleisthenes reorganized civic identity around new tribal and local units designed to weaken aristocratic factionalism. The Athenian democracy that emerged was direct and participatory for citizens, anchored in the assembly and supported by council and courts. Yet it depended on exclusion. Women, slave, and mainly resident foreigners were outside the political community, and the economy and leisure that enabled political participants were underwritten by labor systems that concentrated hardship on non-citizens. Sparta provides the star counter model, a militarized polis structured around discipline, hierarchy, and the extraction of labor from enslaved population of helots, especially in Messenia. Spartan institutions combined elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and communal regulation. The socialization of male citizens prioritized military cohesion over individual ambition. The stability and power of Sparta rested on a paradox. The equality of the citizen-soldier class depended on the systematic subjugation of a large dependent population whose repeated revolts revealed the structural violence of the system. This model produced formidable land power and a distinctive civic ethos, but it also constrained innovation and later chronicle insecurity about internal control. The classical period, typically beginning within the Persian Wars, is often treated as the apex of Greek political and cultural achievement, but it is better understood as a phase in which Greek interstellar competition became unusually consequential and destructive. The Ionian revolt against Persian rule, followed by Persian punitive expeditions, followed the Achaemenid Empire into direct conflict with mainland Greek coalitions. The wars at Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea became foundational myths of Greek freedom and collective identity, yet they also accelerated the rise of homogenic blocs. Athens transformed the Delian League from a defensive alliance into an empire sustained by tribute and naval power, while Sparta positioned itself as a guardian of traditional autonomy and land-based security. The ideological contrast between the Athenian maritime democracy and a Spartan militarized oligarchic order became a defining axis of Greek politics. Athenian imperial power funded monumental building projects and supported a dense cultural ecosystem, including drama, rhetoric, philosophy, and historical writing. The construction of temples like the Parthenon, the flourishing of tragedy and comedy, and the prominence of public debate were not detached culturally. Pardon. The prominence of public debate were not detached cultural ornaments. They were embedded in civic competition, political persuasion, and the symbolic projection of power. At the same time, the Athenian Empire sharpened conflict with allies and rivals because tribute extraction enforced garrisons and political interventions, undermining the autonomy the most polis prized. Greek freedom in this era was never a universal condition, it was a contested slogan used to legitimate dominance as often as to resist it. The Peloponnesian War exposed the fragility of the Greek system, a long conflict between alliance networks dominated by Athens and Sparta. It transformed war from a set piece battle into a broader context involving sieges, naval blockades, attritional strategies, internal coups, and shifting alliances. The war also demonstrated how domestic politics and interstate relations were inseparable factions with Police aligned with external patrons, and civil strife became an instrument of strategy and norms to eroded restraint eroded under pressure. Athens' eventual defeat after the Sicilian expedition catastrophe and the final naval losses was not only military event but a systematic shock that destabilized the legitimacy of democratic imperialism and revealed the cost of overreach. Sparta's victory didn't create a stable order. Spartan attempts to impose oligarchic regimes and dominate the Greek world would generate resistance, and and its rich and its rigid social system limited its capacity to administer or adapt. In the 4th century, Greek politics became a cycle of hegemonic beats. Sparta, then Theban, alongside Athenian efforts to rebuild alliances, none of which consolidated lasting supremacy. Thebes' remarkable military success, especially under Epaminondas, Epaminondas temporarily broke Spartan dominance and contributed to the liberalization of Messenia. But the broader pattern was exhausting. Recurring wars weakened the great polis and created opportunity for external actors, including Persia, to manipulate Greek outcomes through diplomacy, subsidies, and imposed peace settlements. Macedon exploited this fractured landscape. Philip II's rise was not simply the triumph of a superior army, it was a strategic capture of power vacuum created by the Greek disunity. Macedon reforms in infantry tactics and combined arms, alongside with Philip's diplomacy and coercion, culminated in the subordination of much of Greece and the creator of federative structure that preserved the facade of polis autonomy while eliminating strategic independence. Alexander the Great then transformed this Macedonian platform into a campaign that dismantled the Persian Empire and extended Greek influence across the Near East, Egypt, and into Central and South Asia. The significance of Alexander's conquest lies less in a romantic narrative of genius than in a structural consequence. Greek language, urban forms, and elite education became embedded across a vast imperial space, creating a new hybrid society. The Hellenistic period that followed after Alexander's death replaced the polis-centered political order with monarchic states ruled by dynasties that claimed legitimacy through conquest, court culture, religious patronage. The successor kingdoms The cultural center of gravity shifted towards royal capitals such as Alexandria and Antioch, where patronage supported libraries, museums, and scholarly communities. Intellectual life became more specialized and cosmopolitan, and knowledge production increasingly relied on institutional support rather than purely civic frameworks. The period's science and mathematics associated with figures like Euclid and Archimedes was not accidents. They were enabled by stable patronage, concentrated resources, and cross-cultural exchange. Greek culture in the Hellenistic world was both expansive and transformed. It spread through migration, urbanization, military settlements, administrative practice, but it also absorbed local traditions and generated hybrid forms of religion, art, and governance. Greek became the language of much elite communication and scholarship across large regions. Yet, Greek identity itself became more flexible, sometimes defined less by ancestry than by participation in Greek education, language, and civic forms. This cultural elasticity helped Greek influence endure even when Greek political control fractured, because Greekness could be adopted as a prestige package by non-Greek elites and institutionalized in administration and schooling. Roman conquest ended Greek political independence in the Mediterranean, but it did not erase Greek cultural power. Instead, Greek became part of a larger imperial system in which Greek language remained dominant in the eastern Mediterranean, and Greek education became a marker of elite status. Roman elites admired and appropriated Greek art, philosophy, and rhetoric, and the resulting Greco-Roman synthesis carried Greek ideas across the empire. Over time, the Eastern Roman world evolved into what it is called today the Byzantine sphere, preserving Greek learning through later antiquity and the medieval period, while Greek texts also entered Islamic intellectual traditions through translation and commentary, eventually re-entering Western Europe during the Renaissance, in which that helped shaped modern philosophy and science. Ancient Greek society, however, cannot be understood solely through politics and high culture. Its social structure was foundational and often harsh. Citizenship was typically restricted, and the household, not the individual, was the primary economic and social unit. Women's roles varied by the polis that were generally constrained by legal and cultural norms that emphasized domestic management and lineage reproduction, even when women could wield indirect influence through property, religion, family networks. Slavery was widespread when culturally significant culturally significant, providing labor in households, agriculture, mining, and public functions. In Athens and other polis, enslaved labor underscore and underwent economic output and helped the free citizen devote time to politics warfare. While in Sparta, the Heloid system created a state managed form of mass subjugation that shaped every aspect of Spartan life. Greek freedom, therefore, was selective and contingent condition, produced by exclusion and coercion as much as by civic participation. Economic life in the Greek world was diverse and regionally variable. Agriculture remained central with olives, wine, and grain forming staples alongside pastoralism. But trade and craft production expanded, especially in coastal cities. Markets, coinage, and credit systems existed in many places though embedded within social norms and political institutions, rather than functioning as fully autonomous modern markets. Maritime trade connected Greek communities in Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, the Western Mediterranean, and the networks carried not only goods but also technologies, artistic motifs, and religious practices. Economic inequality was persistent, and many political conflicts revolved around the distribution of land, access to office, debt relations, and the control of revenue streams, such as tribute, mines, or port duties. Warfare was a central organizing force in Greek history, shaping institutions and identities. The hoplite flanks, with its emphasis on disciplined infantry, citizen armor ownership, and collective cohesion, reinforced a political ideology of citizen soldiers defending their own community, though the reality varied widely by police and period. Naval power, especially in Athens, created a different social dynamics because Trimi rowing required large numbers of poor citizens that could support broader political inclusion. Over time, warfare became more complex, incorporating mercenary sieges, professionalization, and strategic operations across wider theaters, and particularly during Peloponnesian and Hellenistic periods. Greek military innovation was therefore entangled with political economy. Who fought, who paid, and where who benefited were always contested questions. Religion in ancient Greece was not primarily about private belief in the modern sense. It was a civic system that brought communities to gods through rituals, sacrifice, festivals, and mythic narratives. Sanctuaries served as economic and political centers, hosting treasures, hosting treasuries, adjusting disputes, and staging planned Hellenic festivals that created shared identities across polis. Greek polytheism was flexible and local, with different cities emphasizing different cults, yet the Olympian pantheon provided a recognizable common framework. Religious practice was also an arena of competition, as cities displayed wealth and piety through dedications and monumental temples. Mystery cults and philosophical critiques coexisted with traditional worship and later antiquity. Christianization gradually reconfigured religious life, culminating in institutional closures such as the Academy in Athens under Justinian, symbolically marking an end to a long intellectual era. Greek literature and performance were similarly woven into civic life, and early epic poetry associated with Homer emerged from oral traditions that encoded values of honor, reciprocity, and heroic memory. Lyric poetry, tragedy, and comedy developed within specific performance contexts, often religious festivals sponsored by the city. They served as instruments for public relations, critique, and persuasions. Tragedy explored moral ambiguity, conflict between divine and human law, and the costs of power, while comedy could sanitize leaders, policy, and social norms with sharp immediacy. Proposed genres, history, philosophy, rhetoric, matured in classical period as a political environment, rewarded argumentation, narrative explanation, and analytical inquiry. The emergence of historiography in authors like Herodotus and Thucydides created new standards for explaining events through causation, evidence, and human motives, even as their biases and limitations shaped what later generations could know. Greek science and technology were likewise embedded in broader cultural assumptions about rational order and the intelligibility of nature. Greek mathematicians formalized proof and geometry, while astronomy developed increasingly sophisticated models to describe planetary motion and celestial phenomena. Medical traditions associated with Hippocrates emphasized observation and natural causes, distinguishing medicine as a craft and discipline even when religious healing practices remained widespread. Engineering achievements seen as hydraulics, mechanics, and devices such as the Antikythera mechanism demonstrated that ancient Greek technical capacity could be remarkably advanced when resources, incentives, and skilled laborers aligned. The wider point is that Greek intellectual life produced methods, logical arguments, deductive proof, systematic classification that outlasted particular discoveries, became transferable across cultures and eras. The artistic legacy of ancient Greek rests on a sustained exploration of human form, proportion, and symbolic order, expressed in sculpture, vase painting, architecture, and urban design. Temples articulated relationships between community and divinity through monumental scale, stylized harmony, while sculpture moved from rigid formalic forms to increasingly naturalistic representation that nevertheless retained idealization and compositional control. Greek art became influential not not only because it was technically impressive, but because it encoded a worldwide view in which human bodies, civic order, and divine presence could be rendered as coherent, intelligible structures. Later Roman imitation and revived Renaissance revival ensured that Greek aesthetic norms were repeatedly reinterpreted as universal standards, even though they originated in a specific historical and social environment. The long-term legacy of ancient Greek is therefore best understood as a compound outcome: a decentralized political ecology that rewarded institutional experimentation, a cultural system that could reproduce itself across geography through colonies, language, and education, and an intellectual tradition that privileged argument, analysis, and critical inquiry. Yet the same dynamics that produced innovation also produced chronic instability. Recurrent wars, exclusionary social orders, ancient Greece generated ideas of citizenship, deliberation, and reasoned debate, while simultaneously depending on slavery, gender hierarchy, and coercive domination. Its influence on Rome, Byzantium, Islamic scholars, and modern Europe is undeniable. But that influence is not simply inheritance of progress, it is the transmission of a complex civilizational toolkit, methods, genres, institutions, and symbols capable of empowering both emancipation and control depending on who wields it and for what ends.